Portland, Oregon, March 15, 2019. The rain fell steadily on the streets of downtown Portland that Friday evening, washing away the remnants of another cold Pacific Northwest day. For most residents heading home from work, it was just another unremarkable spring night. But for Rebecca Thompson, a social worker who had dedicated the last 8 years of her career to serving the city's homeless population, something felt profoundly wrong. Rebecca had spent the afternoon making her usual rounds through the downtown area, checking on the individuals she had come to know by name, face, and story. Each person represented more than just a case file to her. They were human beings with histories, dreams, and struggles that had led them to life on the streets. She knew their patterns, their preferred spots, and their daily routines with the kind of familiarity that only comes from genuine care and consistent presence. So glad to have you here. Comment your city so I can bring cases from your region and also know where you're watching me from. But on this particular evening, 3 familiar faces were nowhere to be found. Daniel Martinez, a 42-year-old former construction worker who always set up his tent near the Burnside Bridge. Angela Hayes, a 50-year-old woman who typically spent her nights near the entrance of a closed department store on Morrison Street. And Timothy Brooks, a 35-year-old veteran who preferred the relative shelter of an alcove behind the public library. At first, Rebecca tried to rationalize their absence. People experiencing homelessness often moved locations, sometimes traveling to different neighborhoods or even different cities in search of better opportunities, warmer weather, or simply a change of scenery. It was part of the transient nature of street life that made social work in this field so challenging. However, something about these particular disappearances struck her as unusual. Daniel had been in the same spot for nearly 6 months, longer than most. He had established a sense of territory and routine that suggested stability, at least by street standards. Angela had mental health challenges that made her resistant to change and deeply attached to familiar spaces. And Timothy, despite his struggles with addiction, had been making progress in a rehabilitation program and had expressed hope about his future just days earlier. Rebecca began asking around, speaking with other members of the homeless community who gathered in the downtown area. The responses she received only deepened her concern. Nobody had seen any of the 3 individuals leave. There had been no goodbyes, no mentions of plans to move elsewhere, no gradual fade from the community. They had simply vanished, as if they had never existed at all. Over the following days, Rebecca expanded her search. She visited the Pioneer Place Mall, where many sought warmth during operating hours. She checked the soup kitchens and the emergency shelters that dotted the downtown corridor. She even ventured to the camps along the riverside, where larger groups of homeless individuals had established more permanent settlements. Everywhere she went, the answer was the same. Nobody had seen Daniel, Angela, or Timothy. What made the situation even more peculiar was the discovery of their belongings. In the alcove where Timothy usually stayed, Rebecca found his backpack, still packed with his clothes, identification documents, and a photograph of his young daughter that he treasured above all else. For someone living on the streets, these possessions represented everything. They were not the kind of items anyone would abandon voluntarily. Rebecca documented everything meticulously, taking photographs and writing detailed notes about each disappearance. She compiled information about when each person was last seen, who they had been with, and what they had been doing. A pattern began to emerge, one that sent a chill down her spine despite the mild spring weather. All 3 individuals had been regular visitors to the Cascade Street Mission, a nonprofit shelter and rehabilitation center that provided meals, temporary housing, and support services. More specifically, all 3 had recently enrolled in a new program offered through the mission, something described as an intensive rehabilitation opportunity that included job training and medical support. Rebecca reached out to the Portland Police Bureau, requesting that they investigate the disappearances. The response was disappointing, but not entirely unexpected. The officer she spoke with explained that adults had the right to come and go as they pleased, and that people experiencing homelessness often moved without notice. Unless there was evidence of foul play, there was little the police could do. Missing persons reports would be filed, but active investigation would be limited. Frustrated but undeterred, Rebecca decided to continue her own investigation. She began spending more time at the Cascade Street Mission, observing the operations and speaking with staff members and other clients. The mission was run by a well-respected organization that had been serving Portland's homeless community for over 15 years. Its director, a man named Patrick Sullivan, was known throughout the city as a dedicated philanthropist who had devoted his life to helping those in need. Yet as Rebecca dug deeper, small inconsistencies began to surface. The new rehabilitation program that Daniel, Angela, and Timothy had joined was not well publicized. Few people seemed to know much about it, and those who did offered only vague descriptions. The program apparently involved off-site treatment at a partner facility, but details about the location and specific services remained unclear. Rebecca's concern transformed into genuine alarm when she discovered something else. While reviewing her case files from the previous months, she realized that Daniel, Angela, and Timothy were not the only clients who had disappeared. Over the past 6 months, at least 4 other individuals she had worked with had also vanished without explanation. All of them had been regulars at the Cascade Street Mission. All of them had mentioned something about a special opportunity or program. The rain continued to fall on Portland as Rebecca sat in her small office late one evening, surrounded by files and photographs. She stared at the faces looking back at her from the documents spread across her desk. 7 people. 7 individuals who had struggled and survived on the streets, who had sought help from a system designed to protect them, and who had now disappeared into thin air. Rebecca picked up her phone and dialed the police department once more. This time, she would not be dismissed. This time, she had evidence of a pattern that could not be ignored. As she waited for someone to answer, she looked out her window at the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement below. Somewhere out there, answers waited to be found. And Rebecca Thompson was determined to find them, no matter what darkness those answers might reveal. Portland, Oregon, April 2019. Detective Stephen Morrison had been with the Portland Police Bureau for nearly 17 years, long enough to develop both a sharp investigative instinct and a healthy skepticism about cases that seemed to materialize out of thin air. When Rebecca Thompson appeared at his desk on a gray Monday morning in early April, carrying a worn messenger bag stuffed with files and photographs, he initially assumed this would be another routine meeting that would lead nowhere. Stephen had handled missing persons cases involving the homeless population before. They were invariably complicated, often heartbreaking, and rarely resulted in the kind of resolution that brought closure to anyone involved. People living on the streets moved frequently, sometimes across state lines. They used aliases, avoided official systems, and maintained loose connections even with those who tried to help them. Tracking their movements was like trying to hold water in cupped hands. But as Rebecca spread her documentation across his desk, methodically presenting her findings with the precision of someone who had built an airtight case, Stephen found his skepticism beginning to crack. This was not a concerned citizen with a vague suspicion. This was a professional who had done her homework, and the story she told demanded attention. 7 people. 7 individuals who had vanished over a 6-month period, all connected to the same shelter, all last seen in the same general area of downtown Portland. Rebecca had compiled detailed profiles on each person, including photographs, last known locations, personal habits, and the circumstances surrounding their disappearances. She had interviewed dozens of other homeless individuals, documented their statements, and created a timeline that revealed an unmistakable pattern. Stephen leaned back in his chair, studying the face of Daniel Martinez in one of the photographs. The man looked tired but not defeated, his eyes still holding a spark of determination. According to Rebecca's notes, Daniel had been clean from drugs for 3 months and was actively looking for work when he disappeared. His belongings, including his identification and social security card, had been found abandoned near his usual sleeping spot. That detail alone was significant. Nobody walked away from their ID voluntarily, especially not someone trying to rebuild their life. The detective made a decision. He would open an official investigation, though he cautioned Rebecca that resources were limited and results were far from guaranteed. Over the following weeks, Stephen began the painstaking work of piecing together what had happened to the missing 7. He started by reviewing surveillance footage from businesses and traffic cameras in the downtown area. Portland's network of cameras was extensive, covering major intersections and commercial districts. If someone had left the area by vehicle, there was a chance it had been captured on video. Stephen spent hours reviewing grainy footage, looking for any sign of the missing individuals during the time frame of their disappearances. The breakthrough came on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 weeks into his investigation. Stephen was reviewing footage from a camera positioned near the Cascade Street Mission when he noticed something unusual. A white commercial van, unmarked and relatively new, appeared repeatedly in the recordings over the past 6 months. The van would park near the Mission during late evening hours, typically between 9 and 11 at night, when foot traffic was minimal and the streets were quieter. Stephen tracked the van's appearances across multiple camera feeds. The vehicle would arrive, remain parked for approximately 30 to 45 minutes, and then depart heading east toward the industrial district on the outskirts of downtown. The pattern repeated every 2 to 3 weeks with remarkable consistency. Even more intriguing was the timing. The van's appearances corresponded closely with the dates when Rebecca's clients had last been seen. Armed with this new lead, Stephen expanded his investigation. He began interviewing other individuals who frequented the Cascade Street Mission, focusing on those who had been present during the evening hours when the van appeared. Most people he spoke with remembered very little. The homeless community was large and transient, and one white van looked much like another. However, one man, a 54-year-old named Richard Chen, who had been living on the streets for the past 2 years, provided information that changed everything. Richard recalled seeing the van and remembered it specifically because he had almost accepted a ride in it himself. According to Richard, a man associated with the mission's new rehabilitation program had approached him about 2 months earlier, offering what sounded like an incredible opportunity. The program included transportation to a residential treatment facility located outside the city, where participants would receive intensive therapy, job training, and medical care. They would be housed in clean, safe accommodations and provided with meals and clothing. The program was completely free, funded by grants and charitable donations. Richard had been interested initially, but ultimately decided not to participate because he did not want to leave Portland, where his adult daughter lived and occasionally visited him. He had watched as several other people, including Timothy Brooks, had climbed into the white van on the night they departed for the program. The van had driven away into the darkness, and Richard had never seen any of those people again. Stephen felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came with breaking open a case. This was no longer about people who had simply moved on to other cities. This was about people who had been specifically recruited, transported somewhere, and had never returned. The question was where they had gone, and more importantly, what had happened to them after they arrived. The detective obtained a warrant to examine the records of the Cascade Street Mission. The organization's director, Patrick Sullivan, cooperated fully, presenting himself as shocked and concerned by the allegations. Sullivan provided documentation about the rehabilitation program, explaining that it was run in partnership with a private medical clinic that specialized in addiction treatment and mental health services. The clinic was called New Horizons Wellness Center, located in a renovated building on the eastern edge of the city. According to the partnership agreement, the clinic would provide comprehensive care to individuals referred by the mission, with all costs covered by research grants and pharmaceutical company funding. The program was described as innovative and evidence-based, offering cutting-edge treatments not typically available to the homeless population. Stephen requested and received the consent forms that participants had signed before entering the program. The documents were lengthy and filled with medical terminology, but buried within the dense paragraphs was language that gave him pause. Participants were consenting to experimental treatments, medical procedures that were still in research phases, and the collection of extensive personal health data. They were also waiving certain rights to privacy and agreeing not to discuss the specific treatments they received. The detective contacted New Horizons Wellness Center, requesting information about the program participants. The clinic's administrator, a woman named Dr. Jessica Coleman, was cordial but firm. She explained that patient confidentiality prevented her from disclosing information about individuals in their care without proper legal authority. Stephen would need a court order to access those records. While waiting for the legal process to unfold, Stephen conducted background research on New Horizons Wellness Center and its staff. What he discovered was troubling. The clinic had opened just 18 months earlier, shortly before the partnership with the Cascade Street Mission began. Its primary physician, Dr. Christopher Hayes, had previously worked at a research facility in Nevada that had been shut down following allegations of unethical medical practices. Though no criminal charges had been filed, the facility had lost its medical license and been forced to close. Stephen also investigated Patrick Sullivan's financial records, looking for any unusual transactions. What he found was a series of regular payments from New Horizons Wellness Center to the Cascade Street Mission, totaling tens of thousands of dollars over the past year. The payments were described as administrative fees and partnership overhead, but the amounts seemed excessive for what should have been a charitable arrangement. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, but it was still incomplete. Stephen needed more information about what was actually happening at the clinic, and he needed it quickly. Every day that passed was another day that the missing 7 remained unaccounted for, and another day that potentially more people could be recruited into the program. Stephen approached his lieutenant with a proposal for an undercover operation. He wanted to send someone into the homeless community who could make contact with the mission's recruiters and potentially gain entry to the program. It was risky, requiring resources and approval from multiple levels of the department, but Stephen argued convincingly that it might be their only chance to discover what was really happening to these vulnerable people. The proposal was approved. Within a week, Detective Brian Foster, a younger officer with experience in undercover work, began his preparation. He would pose as a homeless veteran struggling with addiction, a profile that matched several of the missing individuals and would likely make him an attractive candidate for recruitment into the program. As Brian prepared to go undercover and Stephen continued gathering evidence through official channels, Rebecca Thompson maintained her own vigil on the streets. She distributed flyers with photographs of the missing 7, asking anyone with information to come forward. She attended community meetings and spoke with advocacy groups, raising awareness about the disappearances and putting pressure on city officials to take action. Late one night, as Stephen sat in his office reviewing case files, his phone rang. It was Rebecca, her voice tight with urgency. She had just spoken with another homeless individual who had been approached about the program. The person had been told that a van would be picking up new participants the following evening. This was their chance, Rebecca insisted. They needed to be ready. Stephen made several calls, mobilizing his team and coordinating with Brian Foster. Everything was in motion. Tomorrow night, they would finally get a closer look at where the white van was taking people and what awaited them when they arrived. As he gathered his notes and prepared to head home for a few hours of sleep, Stephen could not shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something far worse than he had initially imagined. The missing 7 had vanished for a reason, and that reason was hidden somewhere in the shadows of Portland's streets, waiting to be dragged into the light. Portland, Oregon, May 2019. The undercover operation had yielded results beyond what Detective Stephen Morrison had anticipated. Detective Brian Foster, posing as a homeless veteran named Michael Davis, had successfully infiltrated the recruitment process for the New Horizons program. Over 3 weeks, he had established himself within the downtown homeless community, attended meals at the Cascade Street Mission, and eventually attracted the attention of the program's recruiters. The recruitment process itself was carefully orchestrated. A man who introduced himself as a program coordinator had approached Brian during an evening meal service at the mission. The pitch was compelling and well-rehearsed, offering everything a person struggling on the streets could hope for: safe housing, medical care, counseling services, job training, and a pathway to permanent employment. The program was described as fully funded through research grants and would cost participants nothing. Brian had expressed interest, and within days he was presented with paperwork to review and sign. The consent forms were extensive, running to more than 20 pages of dense legal and medical terminology. Most people in desperate circumstances would have signed without reading carefully, trusting that an organization dedicated to helping them would not deceive them. But Brian read every word, and what he discovered was deeply troubling. Buried within the technical language were clauses indicating that participants would be involved in clinical trials for experimental medications. The forms disclosed that these treatments were not yet approved by federal regulators, and that potential side effects could include serious health complications. Participants agreed to undergo regular medical examinations, provide biological samples, and allow researchers to monitor their health outcomes over an extended period. Most alarming was a section near the end of the document that severely limited participants' ability to withdraw from the program once it began. The forms stated that early departure could result in financial penalties, though it was unclear how penalties could be enforced against individuals with no assets. There was also language about confidentiality agreements, prohibiting participants from discussing the specific treatments they received with anyone outside the program, including family members or other healthcare providers. Brian photographed every page of the consent forms using a concealed camera and transmitted the images to Stephen immediately. The detective spent an entire night reviewing the documents with the department's legal advisor and a medical consultant. Their conclusion was unanimous. While the consent forms were technically legal, they were clearly designed to be confusing and to obscure the true nature of what participants were agreeing to undergo. Armed with this evidence, Stephen obtained a warrant to conduct a comprehensive investigation of New Horizons Wellness Center and its financial relationships. The warrant allowed investigators to examine banking records, communication logs, and internal documents related to the research program and its partnership with the Cascade Street mission. What they uncovered was a systematic operation that exploited vulnerable people under the guise of charitable care. Financial records showed that New Horizons had received substantial funding from 3 pharmaceutical companies over the past 2 years. These companies were paying the clinic to conduct Phase 1 clinical trials, the earliest stage of human testing for new medications, which typically involved healthy volunteers who were compensated for their participation. However, instead of recruiting traditional volunteers through ethical channels, New Horizons was using the homeless population as unwitting test subjects. The clinic could conduct trials more cheaply this way, and the transient nature of the participants meant there would be less scrutiny and fewer questions if something went wrong. The financial arrangement with the Cascade Street mission was essentially a finder's fee. For every person Patrick Sullivan referred to the program, his organization received a payment of $5,000, disguised in the accounting records as administrative costs and partnership fees. Over 18 months, Sullivan had referred more than 40 people to the program, generating over $200,000 in revenue for the mission. Stephen's investigation revealed that many of these individuals had completed the program and been released back into the community. Some had returned to the streets of Portland, while others had moved to different cities or reconnected with family members. However, 7 people had not returned, and their whereabouts remained unknown. These were the individuals Rebecca Thompson had identified, the missing 7 whose disappearance had triggered the investigation. The detective obtained a second warrant, this time specifically targeting medical records related to the 7 missing individuals. What those records revealed was chilling. All 7 had participated in trials for a new medication designed to treat opioid addiction. The drug was intended to reduce cravings and prevent relapse, but it was highly experimental and had shown troubling side effects in animal studies. According to the medical documentation, all 7 participants had experienced severe adverse reactions to the medication. The records described symptoms including irregular heartbeat, respiratory distress, seizures, and organ dysfunction. The documentation became increasingly sparse for each individual, with medical notes ending abruptly and no indication of what treatment, if any, had been provided to address the complications. The final entries in each medical file were nearly identical. A brief note stating that the participant had been transferred to an extended care facility for continued monitoring. The facility was identified as Riverside Recovery Center, located on a rural property approximately 40 miles east of Portland. However, when Stephen attempted to contact Riverside Recovery Center, he discovered that no such facility was licensed or registered with any state health agency. Stephen immediately coordinated with his team to locate the property. County records showed that the land was owned by a limited liability company, which itself was controlled by Dr. Christopher Hayes, the primary physician at New Horizons Wellness Center. The property included a large main building that had previously been used as a private retreat center, along with several outbuildings and substantial acreage. The detective assembled a tactical team and prepared to execute a search warrant on the rural property. Before moving forward, however, he needed to ensure they had sufficient probable cause and that any evidence they discovered would be admissible in court. He consulted with the district attorney's office, presenting all the documentation he had gathered: the consent forms, the financial records, the medical files, and the testimony from witnesses including Brian Foster and Richard Chen. The district attorney agreed that there was sufficient evidence to proceed, and a judge signed the search warrant. Stephen organized a coordinated operation that would involve not only his detectives, but also forensic specialists, medical examiners, and personnel from the county health department. They would approach the property early in the morning, when visibility was good and they could fully assess the situation. As Stephen finalized the operational plan, he received a call from Rebecca Thompson. She had been continuing her own investigation and had made contact with a former employee of New Horizons Wellness Center, a nurse named Amanda Martinez, who had recently resigned from her position. Amanda had reached out to Rebecca after seeing the flyers about the missing individuals, recognizing several of the faces from her time at the clinic. Amanda agreed to meet with Stephen and provide a formal statement. What she described confirmed the detective's worst fears and added new dimensions to the case. She explained that New Horizons had been conducting multiple clinical trials simultaneously, testing various experimental drugs on homeless participants. The medical staff had been instructed to downplay side effects and to continue trials even when participants showed signs of serious adverse reactions. Amanda had witnessed several instances where participants had become critically ill after receiving experimental treatments. Instead of transporting these individuals to hospitals where they would receive proper emergency care, the clinic's physicians had ordered them transferred to the rural property, which they referred to internally as the recovery center. Amanda had never personally visited the property, but she had overheard conversations among the medical staff suggesting that conditions there were far from therapeutic. The nurse also provided information about the clinic's record-keeping practices. She explained that New Horizons maintained 2 sets of records: official files that documented the trials in sanitized language that minimized problems, and unofficial notes that contained more accurate descriptions of what actually occurred. The unofficial records were kept on a separate computer system that was not connected to any network, making them difficult to access or trace. Stephen added this information to his growing case file. The picture that emerged was one of systematic abuse, exploitation, and potentially criminal negligence. Vulnerable people had been lured into a program that promised help, but instead subjected them to dangerous medical experiments without proper informed consent or adequate safety protocols. The night before the planned search of the rural property, Stephen barely slept. He reviewed every detail of the operation, anticipating potential complications and planning contingencies. He thought about the 7 missing people, wondering what they had endured and what condition they might be in if they were still alive. He thought about the dozens of others who had passed through the program, unknowingly serving as human guinea pigs for pharmaceutical companies that should have known better. As dawn broke over Portland on the morning of May 23rd, Stephen gathered with his team in a parking lot 5 miles from the target property. Everyone received final briefings, equipment checks were completed, and vehicles formed a convoy for the approach. Stephen climbed into the lead car, his mind focused on what lay ahead. They were about to descend on a property that might hold answers to questions that had haunted this investigation from the beginning. Whatever they found there would either bring closure to grieving families and justice for the victims, or it would open doors to even darker revelations about how far some people were willing to go in pursuit of profit, using the most vulnerable members of society as disposable subjects in their cruel experiments. Rural Clackamas County, Oregon, May 23, 2019. The convoy of police vehicles moved slowly along the winding rural road, passing through dense forests of Douglas fir and western hemlock that characterize the Oregon landscape east of Portland. The property, identified as Riverside Recovery Center, sat at the end of a private gravel drive, nearly invisible from the main road. Detective Stephen Morrison rode in the lead vehicle, watching as the forest gradually gave way to cleared land surrounding a cluster of buildings. The main structure was a 2-story lodge-style building constructed of timber and stone, its design suggesting it had indeed served as a retreat center at some point in its history. 2 smaller outbuildings stood to the east, their purpose unclear from a distance. A chain-link fence surrounded the entire compound, topped with barbed wire that seemed inconsistent with the peaceful, therapeutic environment the facility was supposed to represent. As the convoy approached the main gate, Stephen noted the presence of security cameras mounted on posts along the fence line. There were no visible guards or staff members outside, and no vehicles were parked in the small lot near the main building's entrance. The property had an abandoned quality to it, though the well-maintained grounds suggested regular upkeep. The tactical team exited their vehicles and approached the gate, which was secured with a heavy padlock. Bolt cutters made quick work of the lock, and the officers proceeded onto the property with weapons drawn, announcing their presence and their legal authority to conduct a search. Stephen followed behind the tactical team, accompanied by forensic specialists and medical personnel who would document anything they discovered. The front door of the main building was unlocked. The team entered cautiously, clearing each room systematically to ensure there were no threats. The interior of the building was stark and institutional, stripped of any decorative elements that might have remained from its previous life as a retreat center. The ground floor consisted of a small reception area, an office, a commercial kitchen, and what appeared to be a common dining space with several tables and chairs. The second floor contained a series of small rooms, each furnished with a basic bed frame, a thin mattress, and a small dresser. The rooms resembled hospital accommodations more than comfortable living quarters. Several of the rooms showed signs of recent occupancy: unmade beds, personal items left on dressers, prescription medication bottles on nightstands. However, there were no people present anywhere in the building. Stephen examined the medication bottles, photographing the labels and prescription information. The medications were a mixture of experimental drugs, identified only by numerical codes and standard pharmaceuticals used to manage pain and other symptoms. None of the bottles bore the names of the 7 missing individuals, but the prescription dates indicated they had been filled within the past few months. The office on the ground floor contained filing cabinets filled with medical records and research documentation. Stephen instructed forensic specialists to collect everything for detailed analysis. He also noticed a desktop computer in the office, which the technical team immediately secured for examination. This could be the system containing the unofficial records that Amanda Martinez had mentioned, the true documentation of what had occurred at the facility. While the main building was being systematically searched and documented, other team members explored the outbuildings. The first was a storage facility containing medical supplies, equipment, and boxes of pharmaceutical products. The inventory was substantial, suggesting a level of medical activity far beyond what would be needed for a small recovery center. The second outbuilding was locked with a more substantial door and multiple security measures. The tactical team breached the entrance and entered cautiously. What they found inside brought the entire operation to a halt. The building had been converted into a makeshift laboratory, complete with examination tables, monitoring equipment, refrigeration units for storing biological samples, and workstations for processing and analyzing data. But it was what else they found in the laboratory building that confirmed Stephen's worst fears. In a climate-controlled storage room at the rear of the laboratory, investigators discovered human remains. The remains were in various stages of preservation, stored in sealed containers and labeled with numerical codes that corresponded to research subject identification numbers. Stephen immediately called for the medical examiner and ordered that the entire property be treated as a crime scene. The discovery transformed the investigation from a case of potential medical misconduct to a homicide investigation. The search became more methodical and more thorough, with every inch of the property subjected to forensic examination. Investigators began the grim task of attempting to identify the remains. The numerical codes on the storage containers were cross-referenced with medical records found in the office. Through this process, they were able to tentatively identify remains belonging to 5 of the 7 missing individuals: Daniel Martinez, Angela Hayes, Timothy Brooks, and 2 others from Rebecca Thompson's list of disappeared persons. The medical examiner conducted preliminary examinations at the scene before the remains were transported to the city morgue for full autopsies. Initial findings suggested that the individuals had died from complications related to the experimental medications they had been administered. The specific causes of death would require toxicology analysis and detailed pathological examination, but it appeared that severe adverse reactions to the drugs had led to organ failure and ultimately death. As this horrifying discovery was being processed, forensic computer specialists were examining the desktop computer found in the office. They successfully accessed the system and discovered exactly what Amanda Martinez had described: a detailed and unfiltered record of the medical experiments conducted at both New Horizons Wellness Center and the rural facility. The digital records documented dozens of clinical trials conducted over an 18-month period. The notes were clinical and detached, describing human suffering in the same dispassionate language one might use to discuss laboratory animals. Participants were referred to by number rather than name. Adverse reactions were documented with precision, but without any indication of empathy or concern. The records showed that when participants experienced serious complications, they were transferred to the rural facility under the pretense of receiving specialized care. In reality, they were being isolated from the outside world so that their deteriorating conditions would not raise alarms or trigger investigations. Some individuals recovered and were eventually released, but others continued to decline. When participants died, their remains were preserved for potential future analysis rather than being returned to families or given proper burial. The computer records also contained correspondence between Dr. Christopher Hayes and representatives of the pharmaceutical companies funding the research. The emails discussed enrollment numbers, data collection protocols, and financial arrangements. There were also exchanges that revealed knowledge of serious safety concerns and deliberate decisions to continue trials despite those concerns. Stephen felt a mixture of rage and profound sadness as he reviewed the evidence. These were people who had been struggling, who had reached out for help, and who had been betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. They had been treated not as human beings deserving of dignity and care, but as convenient test subjects whose lives were considered expendable. Back at the main building, investigators made another significant discovery. In a closet on the second floor, they found personal belongings that had been collected from participants: backpacks, identification documents, photographs, and other items that people carry with them as remnants of their lives and identities. Among these items, they found possessions belonging to all 7 of the missing individuals, confirming that each of them had been at this facility at some point. As the search continued into the afternoon, Stephen coordinated with his team to ensure that every piece of evidence was properly documented and collected. The scale of the crime scene was enormous, and processing it completely would take days or even weeks. But already, they had more than enough evidence to make arrests and bring charges. The question that now dominated Stephen's mind was the whereabouts of the 2 missing individuals whose remains had not been found at the property. Were they still alive somewhere, perhaps moved to another location? Had they somehow escaped? Or were their remains hidden elsewhere on the property, waiting to be discovered? Ground-penetrating radar equipment was brought in to scan the property for any anomalies in the soil that might indicate burial sites. The wooded areas surrounding the cleared compound were searched by officers moving in careful grid patterns. Cadaver dogs were deployed to assist in the search. The investigation had entered a new and darker phase, and Stephen was determined that no stone would be left unturned. As the sun began to set over the rural property, Stephen stood near the main building and surveyed the scene. Police vehicles with flashing lights, forensic tents being erected, investigators moving purposefully through their assigned tasks. This was the culmination of weeks of careful detective work, but it was also the beginning of a much larger process: identifying all the victims, notifying families, building a prosecutorial case, and seeking justice for people who had been forgotten by society and exploited by those who should have protected them. The property held many secrets, and Stephen knew that in the days to come, each secret uncovered would add another layer to this tragedy. Portland, Oregon, June 2019. The evidence collected from the rural property painted a picture of systematic exploitation that extended far beyond what Detective Stephen Morrison had initially imagined. As forensic teams continued processing the crime scene and analyzing thousands of pages of documents, the investigation expanded to encompass multiple individuals and organizations who had participated in or enabled the illegal medical experiments. The computer records seized from the facility revealed a network of complicity that reached into corners of the medical and pharmaceutical industries that most people trusted implicitly. Dr. Christopher Hayes had not been operating alone. He had worked with two other physicians, Dr. Jessica Coleman and Dr. Marcus Thompson, both of whom held positions at New Horizons Wellness Center. All three had previously worked together at the Nevada research facility that had been shut down for ethical violations, and they had apparently continued their questionable practices in Oregon under a new organizational structure. The digital correspondence showed that the three physicians had deliberately targeted the homeless population for their research specifically because these individuals were vulnerable and unlikely to have family members or advocates who would ask difficult questions about their well-being. The doctors had recognized that people living on the streets often had complex medical histories, including addiction and mental health issues, which made them valuable research subjects for pharmaceutical companies developing treatments for these conditions. Patrick Sullivan, the director of the Cascade Street mission, had been fully aware of the true nature of the program he was referring people to. The financial records demonstrated that he had negotiated the payment structure with New Horizons, understanding that he was being compensated for providing research subjects rather than for facilitating legitimate treatment services. Email exchanges showed Sullivan discussing recruitment targets and strategies for identifying individuals who would be unlikely to refuse the offer or to have outside contacts who might interfere. The pharmaceutical companies that had funded the research occupied a more complicated position in the web of responsibility. Three companies had paid substantial sums to New Horizons for conducting early-stage clinical trials of experimental medications. The contracts they had signed with the clinic included standard language about ethical research practices and regulatory compliance. However, investigators found evidence suggesting that representatives from at least two of the companies had visited the rural facility and had been aware that the research subjects were homeless individuals being housed in isolated conditions. Stephen worked closely with federal investigators from the Food and Drug Administration and the Department of Justice to determine the extent of corporate knowledge and responsibility. The investigation revealed that the pharmaceutical companies had not asked detailed questions about how New Horizons was recruiting and managing research participants, operating under a willful ignorance that allowed them to benefit from cheaper and faster clinical trials without taking direct responsibility for the unethical methods being used. The autopsy results for the 5 individuals whose remains had been found at the property confirmed that all had died from complications related to the experimental medications. The specific mechanisms of death varied, but in each case, the individual had experienced severe adverse reactions that had been inadequately treated. Medical records showed that instead of providing appropriate emergency care or transferring patients to hospitals, the physicians at the facility had continued monitoring the declining subjects while collecting data about the progression of their symptoms. The 2 missing individuals whose remains had not been found became the focus of intensive search efforts. Ground-penetrating radar scans of the property identified several anomalies in the soil composition that warranted excavation. Over 3 days, forensic teams carefully dug at multiple locations on the property. They discovered buried medical waste and contaminated materials that had been improperly disposed of, but they did not find additional human remains. Stephen expanded the investigation to explore whether the 2 individuals might have been transferred to another location before they died, or whether they had somehow survived and left the facility. He reviewed transportation records, interviewed staff members who had worked at the property, and examined every reference to the 2 individuals in the medical documentation. The trail seemed to end at the rural facility, with no clear indication of what had become of them after their final documented medical evaluations. The break in this aspect of the case came from an unexpected source. A former security guard who had worked at the rural property contacted the police after seeing news coverage of the investigation. The guard, whose name was Andrew Wilson, had been employed by a private security company contracted to monitor the facility during overnight hours. He had been troubled by what he witnessed during his shifts, but had been afraid to come forward while the operation was active. Andrew provided a statement describing what he had seen during the 6 months he worked at the property. He explained that participants in the medical program were closely monitored and were not allowed to leave the facility without supervision. Those who became seriously ill were moved to a separate room in the main building that the staff referred to as the intensive care unit, though it lacked the equipment and personnel that would be present in an actual intensive care setting. According to Andrew, he had witnessed 2 individuals being removed from the facility late at night, transported in a van that arrived after midnight. He had been told that these individuals were being transferred to a hospital for emergency treatment. But the van had no medical markings, and the people who came to collect the patients were not dressed as paramedics or medical personnel. The timing of these late-night transfers corresponded with the disappearance of the 2 individuals whose remains had not been found at the property. Stephen obtained records from the security company that had employed Andrew, including logs of vehicles entering and leaving the property. The logs confirmed that a van had visited the facility on the dates Andrew described. The vehicle was registered to a medical transport company based in Washington state, approximately 200 miles north of Portland. Investigators contacted authorities in Washington and discovered that the medical transport company was actually a front for an illegal operation disposing of medical waste and biological materials. The company's owner, a man named Gregory Mitchell, had been operating without proper licenses and had been accepting payments from various medical facilities to handle materials they wanted removed discreetly, without going through official channels that would create documentation and regulatory oversight. Gregory was arrested and agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. He admitted that he had been contracted by Dr. Hayes to transport 2 individuals from the rural facility and to dispose of their remains after they died. Gregory explained that he had been told the individuals were deceased when he collected them, though he could not confirm this independently. He had transported the bodies to a crematorium in southern Washington that was willing to process remains without asking questions about death certificates or proper documentation. This revelation meant that the remains of the final 2 victims had been destroyed, eliminating the possibility of conducting autopsies or recovering their bodies for burial. It also added another layer to the criminal conspiracy, demonstrating the lengths to which Dr. Hayes and his associates had gone to conceal the deaths that resulted from their experiments. The scope of the investigation continued to widen as more information emerged. Amanda Martinez, the nurse who had initially come forward with information about New Horizons Wellness Center, provided additional details about the clinic's operations. She identified other staff members who had knowledge of the illegal activities and helped investigators understand the internal culture that had allowed such practices to continue for 18 months. Several other former employees agreed to provide testimony once they understood that they might face criminal charges as accessories if they remained silent. These individuals described an environment where concerns about patient safety were dismissed and where staff members were pressured to prioritize data collection over ethical treatment of research subjects. Those who expressed discomfort with the protocols were told that the homeless participants were fortunate to receive any medical care at all, and that the research being conducted would ultimately benefit millions of people by advancing medical science. Stephen compiled all of this evidence into a comprehensive case file that would serve as the foundation for criminal prosecutions. The charges being prepared included multiple counts of murder, involuntary manslaughter, medical fraud, conspiracy, and violations of numerous regulations governing human research. The district attorney's office assigned a team of prosecutors to handle what would clearly be a complex and high-profile case. As June drew to a close, arrest warrants were issued for Dr. Christopher Hayes, Dr. Jessica Coleman, Dr. Marcus Thompson, Patrick Sullivan, and Gregory Mitchell. Federal charges were also being prepared against executives at one of the pharmaceutical companies, where evidence suggested direct knowledge of the unethical research practices. The coordinated arrests took place simultaneously across multiple locations, with each suspect taken into custody without incident. The arrests generated substantial media attention, bringing national focus to the exploitation of homeless populations in medical research. Advocacy groups called for stronger protections and oversight. Medical licensing boards initiated reviews of their approval processes. Pharmaceutical companies announced new policies regarding clinical trial monitoring. The case had exposed vulnerabilities in the systems meant to protect the most vulnerable members of society. For Stephen and his team, the arrests marked the transition from investigation to prosecution. The detective knew that the legal proceedings would be lengthy and challenging, requiring them to present complex medical and scientific evidence to judges and juries. But the foundation had been laid, and the evidence was overwhelming. Justice would finally be possible for the 12 people who had been victimized, 7 of whom had paid with their lives for the greed and callousness of those who had seen them, not as human beings, but as convenient test subjects whose absence from the world would go largely unnoticed by everyone except one dedicated social worker who had refused to let their disappearances remain a mystery. Portland, Oregon, March 2020. 10 months after the discovery at the rural property, the trial of Dr. Christopher Hayes and his co-conspirators began at the Multnomah County Courthouse in downtown Portland. The proceedings drew significant public attention, with court observers filling the gallery each day and media outlets providing regular coverage of the testimony and evidence presented. The prosecution built its case methodically, presenting the jury with a comprehensive picture of how the defendants had systematically exploited homeless individuals for profit. Medical experts testified about the experimental nature of the drugs that had been administered and the inadequacy of the safety protocols that should have been in place. Forensic specialists explained the evidence found at the rural facility and what it revealed about the treatment of research subjects. Former employees described the culture of disregard for patient welfare that had permeated both New Horizons Wellness Center and the isolated compound where the most serious abuses had occurred. Rebecca Thompson took the witness stand to describe her initial concerns about the missing individuals and the pattern of disappearances she had identified. Her testimony provided context about the vulnerability of the victims and the trust they had placed in institutions that claimed to help them. She explained how people living on the streets often had to accept whatever assistance was offered without the luxury of thoroughly investigating whether that assistance was genuine or exploitative. The families of the victims also provided testimony, describing the people their loved ones had been before circumstances had led them to homelessness. Daniel Martinez's sister spoke about his struggles with addiction following a workplace injury and how he had been working hard to rebuild his life before he disappeared. Angela Hayes's adult daughter described her mother's mental health challenges and her own efforts to maintain contact despite the difficulties. Timothy Brooks's ex-wife testified about his service in the military and the trauma that had contributed to his difficulties after returning to civilian life. The defense attorneys attempted to argue that the defendants had believed they were conducting legitimate research that would ultimately benefit society. They suggested that the deaths had been unforeseeable complications rather than the result of criminal negligence. However, the prosecution effectively countered these arguments by presenting the defendants' own communications, which demonstrated clear awareness of safety concerns and deliberate decisions to prioritize data collection and financial gain over the well-being of research subjects. The email correspondence between Dr. Hayes and pharmaceutical company representatives proved particularly damaging. The messages showed that Hayes had been warned about potential safety issues with some of the experimental medications, but had continued the trials anyway, assuring the companies that he would manage any complications discreetly. When adverse reactions occurred, Hayes had characterized them as isolated incidents rather than systematic problems, allowing the trials to continue and more individuals to be enrolled. Patrick Sullivan's defense attempted to distance him from the medical aspects of the operation, portraying him as a well-intentioned nonprofit director who had been deceived by medical professionals about the nature of the program. However, the financial records and his own emails undermined this portrayal, revealing that he had negotiated payment terms and discussed recruitment strategies with full knowledge that participants were being used as research subjects rather than receiving therapeutic treatment. The trial lasted 7 weeks, with testimony from more than 60 witnesses and the introduction of thousands of pages of documentary evidence. The jury deliberated for 4 days before returning verdicts. Dr. Christopher Hayes was found guilty on multiple counts of murder, medical fraud, and conspiracy. Dr. Jessica Coleman and Dr. Marcus Thompson were convicted of similar charges, though with variations reflecting their specific roles in the operation. Patrick Sullivan was found guilty of conspiracy and fraud charges related to his recruitment activities. Gregory Mitchell, who had cooperated with investigators, received a reduced sentence but was still convicted of improper disposal of human remains and operating an illegal medical waste business. The sentencing phase of the proceedings took place 2 months after the verdicts. Dr. Hayes received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, reflecting the severity of his crimes and his leadership role in the criminal enterprise. Dr. Coleman and Dr. Thompson each received sentences of 45 years. Patrick Sullivan was sentenced to 25 years for his role in recruiting and delivering victims to the program. The sentences ensured that none of the primary defendants would be released while still in their productive years, effectively ending their ability to harm others. The pharmaceutical companies that had funded the research faced civil penalties and regulatory sanctions rather than criminal charges. Federal investigations concluded that while the companies had been negligent in their oversight and had failed to ask appropriate questions about how clinical trials were being conducted, there was insufficient evidence to prove criminal intent at the corporate level. The companies paid substantial settlements to the families of victims and agreed to implement enhanced monitoring protocols for all future clinical research they sponsored. Beyond the courtroom, the case catalyzed significant changes in how vulnerable populations were protected in medical research contexts. Oregon passed legislation strengthening requirements for informed consent in clinical trials and establishing enhanced oversight mechanisms for research involving homeless individuals or others in vulnerable circumstances. The law also created mandatory reporting requirements for shelters and social service organizations that partnered with medical facilities, ensuring that patterns of concern could be identified more quickly. Rebecca Thompson continued her work as a social worker, though the experience had profoundly affected her approach to advocacy. She became a leading voice for homeless rights in Portland, speaking at community forums and working with policymakers to improve services and protections. She established a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing independent advocacy for homeless individuals who were offered participation in medical programs, ensuring they had access to unbiased information and support in making decisions about their care. The Cascade Street mission underwent significant changes in leadership and governance following Patrick Sullivan's conviction. A new board of directors was appointed, and the organization implemented comprehensive ethics training and oversight procedures. The mission continued providing services to Portland's homeless population, but with renewed commitment to protecting the dignity and rights of those they served. For the families of the victims, the trial's conclusion brought a mixture of relief and ongoing grief. They had finally received answers about what had happened to their loved ones, but those answers had confirmed worst fears and exposed the cruelty and indifference their family members had experienced. Several families filed civil lawsuits seeking damages from the various institutions and individuals who had participated in or enabled the illegal research program. These cases were settled out of court for undisclosed amounts. The remains of the 5 victims who had been recovered from the rural property were returned to their families for burial. Memorial services were held, attended by community members, advocates, and others who wanted to honor the victims and acknowledge the injustice they had suffered. For Daniel Martinez, Angela Hayes, Timothy Brooks, and the others, death had at least been followed by recognition and remembrance. The 2 victims whose remains had been destroyed presented a more complicated situation. Without bodies to bury, their families held memorial services focused on celebrating their lives and acknowledging their absence. The destruction of their remains added an extra layer of violation to the crimes committed against them, denying their families even the small comfort of being able to visit a grave or final resting place. Detective Stephen Morrison received recognition for his investigative work on the case, though he remained characteristically modest about his role. In interviews, he consistently emphasized that the case had been solved through the efforts of many people, particularly Rebecca Thompson, whose initial observations and persistent advocacy had set everything in motion. Stephen continued working in the Portland Police Bureau's investigative division, bringing the same thoroughness and dedication to subsequent cases. As the 1-year anniversary of the initial discovery approached, Portland held a community vigil to remember the victims and to reaffirm commitment to protecting vulnerable populations. Hundreds of people gathered in a downtown park, including many individuals who were themselves experiencing homelessness. Speakers addressed the crowd about dignity, justice, and the obligation society has to care for all its members, especially those who face the greatest challenges. The case had forced uncomfortable confrontations with questions about how society values different lives and how easily some people can be overlooked or dismissed. The victims had been struggling with addiction, mental illness, and poverty, circumstances that had made them vulnerable to exploitation. But they had also been fathers, mothers, siblings, veterans, and individuals with histories, dreams, and inherent worth that should have been recognized and protected. The transformation that followed the case was not complete or perfect. Homeless individuals continued to face enormous challenges in Portland and cities across the country. Medical research continued to grapple with ethical questions about informed consent and vulnerable populations. But something had shifted. Awareness had increased. Protections had been strengthened. And the memory of what had happened served as a reminder of what could occur when society's most vulnerable members were viewed not as people deserving of care and respect, but as convenient subjects whose lives mattered less than profit and scientific curiosity. In the end, the case demonstrated both the worst and best of human nature. The worst was exemplified by those who had exploited desperation for personal gain, who had treated human beings as disposable resources, and who had hidden their crimes behind facades of charity and medical progress. The best was represented by people like Rebecca Thompson, who had noticed when others disappeared, who had refused to accept easy explanations, and who had fought to ensure that forgotten lives were remembered and honored. Her determination had led to justice for 12 people who might otherwise have vanished without anyone ever knowing the truth about what happened to them, their absences attributed to the transient nature of homelessness rather than to the criminal actions of those who saw their vulnerability as an opportunity.